Why some people act completely cold after a breakup, only to return months later like nothing happened. The truth is, avoidants don't always process emotions the way most people do. While you're crying, chasing, and trying to fix the relationship, they often shut down, detach, and convince themselves they never cared that deeply. But here's what nobody tells you. The moment you stop chasing, stop begging, and start focusing on yourself, something strange begins to happen inside their mind. In this video, we're diving deep into the hidden psychology of avoidance through the lens of Carl Jung, uncovering why distance creates attraction, why silence affects them more than emotional pressure, and the one powerful shift that can completely change the dynamic between you and them. If you've ever been confused by mixed signals, emotional walls, or sudden disappearances, stay until the end, because what you're about to hear might completely change how you see avoidance forever. One of the most confusing things about avoidance is how calm and emotionally unaffected they can seem after a breakup. While the other person is overwhelmed with emotions, replaying memories, and searching for answers, the avoidant often appears distant, cold, or even relieved. But what many people fail to understand is that avoidants usually don't process emotional pain in the moment. Their mind is trained to survive by suppressing vulnerability, disconnecting from intense feelings, and creating emotional distance whenever relationships become too overwhelming. This is why, during the breakup, they may convince themselves that leaving was the right decision, that they're better off alone, or that the relationship wasn't that serious to begin with. On the surface, it looks like they've moved on instantly, but internally, something much deeper is happening. Avoidants are experts at distraction. They bury themselves in work, routines, entertainment, new experiences, or temporary freedom because silence forces them to confront emotions they've spent years trying to avoid. At first, this emotional escape feels empowering. They enjoy the space, the independence, and the absence of emotional pressure. But eventually, reality begins to change. The texts stop coming. The emotional safety they once had disappears. The person who constantly cared for them is no longer emotionally available, and that's when the silent regret slowly begins to appear. Unlike anxious individuals who feel pain immediately, avoidants often experience delayed emotions. The loss hits them later, sometimes weeks or even months after the relationship ends. Small moments begin triggering memories they thought they had escaped. A familiar song, a quiet night alone, seeing your absence where your presence once existed. These things start breaking through the emotional walls they carefully built. This is the part most people never see because avoidants rarely express regret openly. Their pride and fear of vulnerability make it difficult for them to admit they miss someone deeply. Instead, they may quietly check your social media, ask mutual friends about you, or suddenly reappear with casual messages that seem emotionally disconnected on the surface, but carry hidden emotional curiosity underneath. What makes this even more powerful is that the regret grows stronger when they realize you are no longer chasing them. When you stop begging for validation, stop forcing conversations, and begin rebuilding your own life, the dynamic changes completely. The avoidant no longer feels emotional pressure pushing them away. Instead, they are left alone with their own thoughts, their own silence, and the uncomfortable realization that someone who genuinely cared is slowly becoming emotionally unavailable to them. This creates a psychological contrast they struggle to ignore. In many ways, this connects deeply to the ideas of Carl Jung, who believed that people often hide the parts of themselves they fear confronting the most. Avoidants hide vulnerability behind distance and independence, but buried emotions don't disappear forever. Eventually, the emotions they avoided begin surfacing through loneliness, curiosity, regret, and emotional reflection. And by the time they finally understand what they lost, the person they left behind is often no longer waiting in the same place emotionally. One of the biggest mistakes people make when dealing with an avoidant is believing that more love, more effort, and more emotional intensity will finally make them open up. In reality, the opposite often happens. The more you chase an avoidant, the more emotionally distant they become. This creates one of the most painful relationship dynamics because the person chasing usually thinks they are fighting for love, while the avoidant experiences that same behavior as emotional pressure. To understand this, you have to look deeper into how avoidants are psychologically wired. Most avoidants learned very early in life that vulnerability feels unsafe. Whether it came from emotionally unavailable parenting, criticism, rejection, or inconsistent affection, they developed a defense mechanism built around self-protection and emotional independence. Over time, they trained themselves to suppress emotional needs instead of expressing them openly. So when relationships become deeply emotional, intense, or demanding, their nervous system doesn't interpret it as connection. It interprets it as danger. This is why chasing creates the exact reaction people are trying to avoid. Constant texting, emotional conversations, begging for reassurance, repeatedly asking where the relationship is going, or trying to force closeness can overwhelm an avoidant's internal world. Even if they care about you, the pressure activates their defense system almost automatically. Instead of leaning closer, they begin searching for emotional escape routes. They may become cold, distracted, irritated, emotionally numb, or suddenly need space without fully understanding why themselves. To the person chasing, this feels confusing and cruel because the harder they try to fix the connection, the more disconnected the avoidant becomes. But psychologically, the avoidant is not always running from the person. They are running from the emotional intensity happening inside themselves. One of the most important things to understand is that avoidants value emotional control more than emotional closeness. When they feel someone becoming too emotionally dependent on them, it can trigger a fear of losing freedom, autonomy, or inner stability. This fear creates an unconscious urge to regain control by pulling away. The more emotional energy comes toward them, the stronger their instinct becomes to create distance. This is why emotional chasing often turns into a painful cycle. The anxious person increases pursuit because they fear losing the relationship, while the avoidant withdraws further because they feel emotionally trapped. Both people are reacting to fear, but in completely opposite ways. What makes this dynamic even more frustrating is that avoidants often reconnect once the pressure disappears. The moment you stop chasing, stop demanding emotional answers, and emotionally detach from the outcome, the avoidant suddenly feels safer again. Why? Because the emotional intensity that activated their defenses is no longer suffocating them. Silence gives them room to process emotions at their own pace without feeling controlled or overwhelmed. This is why many avoidants come back only after distance has been created. It's not always manipulation. Often, it's the first moment they can actually hear their own feelings without panic drowning them out. This connects closely to the psychological ideas of Carl Jung, who believed that people unconsciously avoid the parts of themselves they fear confronting. Avoidants often suppress vulnerability so deeply that emotional closeness starts exposing emotions they've spent years hiding. And when someone chases them intensely, it forces those hidden emotions to the surface faster than they can emotionally handle. So instead of moving toward love, they emotionally disappear in order to protect themselves from feelings they never learned how to safely process. One of the most powerful shifts that happens after a breakup with an avoidant begins the moment you stop making them the center of your emotional world. At first, emotional detachment sounds cold or manipulative, but true detachment is neither. It's not about pretending you don't care, playing mind games, or forcing someone to chase you. Real emotional detachment is about becoming emotionally grounded within yourself again. It's the moment you stop obsessing over their texts, stop monitoring their behavior, stop trying to convince them to love you, and finally redirect your energy back toward your own peace, confidence, and personal growth. Ironically, this is often the exact shift that changes the entire dynamic with an avoidant. When you constantly chase an avoidant, they subconsciously feel emotionally crowded. Your energy keeps pulling on them emotionally, demanding reassurance, clarity, or closeness they may not yet know how to provide. But when you emotionally step back, something unexpected happens. The emotional pressure disappears. Suddenly, they are no longer reacting to your pursuit. Instead, they are left alone with space, silence, and the absence of someone who once gave them constant emotional attention. And for many avoidants, that silence becomes louder than any argument or emotional conversation ever could. This is because avoidants often don't process emotions clearly when they feel overwhelmed. Their instinct is to shut down emotionally in order to regain a sense of control. But once the chasing stops, their nervous system begins calming down, and they finally have room to reflect on what the relationship actually meant to them. This is why many avoidants only begin missing someone after that person emotionally detaches and moves forward. The absence creates contrast. They start noticing what is no longer there: the support, the comfort, the familiarity, the emotional safety they quietly relied on but rarely acknowledged openly. Emotional detachment also changes your energy in a way that avoidants deeply notice, even if they never say it directly. When someone becomes emotionally grounded, they stop radiating desperation and fear. They no longer seek validation from the avoidant's attention or approval. Instead, they begin rebuilding their own identity outside the relationship. They reconnect with friends, goals, routines, passions, and self-respect. This creates a quiet confidence that naturally shifts attraction because emotionally healthy energy feels safe rather than demanding. Avoidants are often drawn toward people who feel emotionally stable and independent because it lowers their fear of emotional engulfment. In other words, when you stop emotionally clinging to them, they no longer feel trapped by your presence. And this is where the dynamic unexpectedly reverses. The avoidant who once pulled away may suddenly become curious, attentive, or emotionally reflective. They may start checking your social media, finding excuses to contact you, or subtly testing whether you still care. Not because you manipulated them, but because your emotional absence forced them to confront feelings they previously escaped through distance. This idea aligns strongly with the psychological insights of Carl Jung, who believed that people are often transformed when they confront what they unconsciously avoid. Avoidants spend much of their lives avoiding vulnerability and emotional dependence, but emotional detachment removes the noise and forces reflection. And sometimes, the moment you truly let go emotionally is the same moment they finally begin realizing your value in a way they never could while you were chasing them. One of the most fascinating ways to understand avoidant behavior is through the concept of the shadow, introduced by Carl Jung. Jung believed that every person has hidden parts of themselves they unconsciously reject, suppress, or deny because those emotions feel uncomfortable, weak, or unsafe. These hidden emotions form what he called the shadow. For avoidants, this shadow often contains vulnerability, emotional dependency, fear of rejection, loneliness, and the deep desire for love and connection. On the surface, avoidants usually appear independent, emotionally controlled, self-sufficient, and unaffected by emotional situations. They may pride themselves on needing nobody, staying detached, or avoiding emotional drama altogether. But according to Jungian psychology, the stronger someone tries to suppress a part of themselves, the stronger that hidden part quietly controls them beneath the surface. This means many avoidants are not truly free from emotions. They are often disconnected from emotions they learned to hide long ago. Their independence can sometimes become a defense mechanism, protecting them from emotional exposure rather than genuine emotional strength. This usually begins early in life. Many avoidants grow up in environments where vulnerability was ignored, criticized, or emotionally unsafe. As a result, they unconsciously learn that expressing emotional needs leads to disappointment, shame, or loss of control. So instead of openly processing emotions, they push those feelings deep into the shadow. Over time, emotional distance becomes survival. They convince themselves they are better alone, that emotions make people weak, or that closeness eventually leads to pain. But buried emotions never truly disappear. Jung believed that whatever remains hidden in the shadow continues influencing behavior unconsciously. This explains why avoidants often send mixed signals in relationships. One part of them deeply desires love, intimacy, and emotional safety, while another part fears being consumed, controlled, or hurt by those same emotions. This internal conflict creates the push and pull dynamic so common with avoidants. They move closer when they crave connection, then suddenly withdraw once vulnerability begins surfacing. To the other person, this behavior feels confusing and inconsistent, but internally the avoidant is battling emotions they struggle to fully acknowledge even within themselves. The shadow also explains why avoidants sometimes react strongly to emotional intimacy. When someone genuinely loves them, supports them, or gets emotionally close, it forces hidden emotions to rise toward the surface. Their buried fears of dependency, rejection, or emotional inadequacy become activated. Instead of consciously processing those feelings, their defense system often responds automatically through distancing, emotional numbness, avoidance, or sudden withdrawal. In many cases, the avoidant is not running from the relationship itself. They are running from the vulnerable parts of themselves the relationship exposes. This is also why silence and distance can affect avoidance so deeply after a breakup. Once the relationship ends and emotional distractions fade away, the shadow slowly begins surfacing through loneliness, regret, nostalgia, and emotional reflection. The feelings they once suppressed no longer have constant distractions covering them. And because avoidants are often disconnected from their emotional world during the relationship, they may only begin fully understanding their feelings after losing the connection entirely. Jung believed true growth happens when people stop running from their shadow and begin integrating the hidden parts of themselves with honesty and self-awareness. For avoidants, this means learning that vulnerability is not weakness. Emotional closeness is not loss of freedom, and love does not have to threaten their identity. But until they confront those hidden fears, they often continue repeating the same cycle, craving connection deeply while simultaneously pushing it away the moment it becomes real. One of the most confusing experiences after dealing with an avoidant is noticing that even after they pull away, go silent, or end the relationship, they still seem to watch you from a distance. They may stop replying to messages, avoid emotional conversations, or act completely detached, yet somehow they continue checking your stories, liking old posts, viewing your updates within minutes, or quietly asking mutual friends about your life. To many people, this behavior feels contradictory and emotionally confusing. If they wanted distance so badly, why are they still keeping tabs on you? The answer lies in the complicated emotional world. Avoidants often hide beneath their detached exterior. Avoidants are not emotionless people. In fact, many of them feel emotions very deeply, but they struggle with direct emotional vulnerability. Watching from a distance allows them to stay emotionally connected without exposing themselves to the intensity of real intimacy or confrontation. Social media becomes a safe form of connection because it gives them emotional access without emotional risk. They can see your life, feel your presence, and quietly monitor whether you are moving on, all while maintaining the emotional distance that makes them feel protected. This behavior often becomes stronger after a breakup, because avoidants tend to process emotions differently from more emotionally expressive people. During the relationship or immediately after the breakup, their defense system may shut down emotional awareness to help them avoid discomfort. They distract themselves, convince themselves they're fine, or focus heavily on independence and freedom. But over time, especially when the emotional pressure disappears, curiosity slowly begins replacing emotional avoidance. They start wondering what you're doing, whether you still care, whether you've changed, or whether someone else has taken their place emotionally. Instead of reaching out directly and risking vulnerability, they observe quietly from a distance because observation feels emotionally safer than genuine openness. In many cases, avoidants also watch because your absence creates psychological contrast. When you were emotionally available, constantly present, and chasing the relationship, they may have taken your attention for granted. But once you emotionally detach and begin focusing on yourself, the dynamic changes. Suddenly, they can no longer predict your emotions or rely on your constant availability. This uncertainty creates curiosity, and curiosity often pulls avoidants back into quiet observation. They may not consciously realize it, but part of them is searching for emotional reassurance, without having to openly admit they miss you. Social media checking can also reflect internal emotional conflict. One side of the avoidant wants distance and emotional control, while another side still feels attached to the emotional bond they shared with you. Instead of fully reconnecting or fully letting go, they remain emotionally in between, detached physically, but still psychologically connected. This is why avoidants sometimes send subtle signals instead of direct communication. A random like, viewing every story, or suddenly becoming active online after long silence may seem small, but these actions often reveal emotional curiosity they struggle to express openly. This behavior connects closely to the ideas of Carl Jung, particularly his belief that people often hide vulnerable emotions within the unconscious mind. Avoidants may consciously act independent and emotionally unaffected, but their unconscious attachment still seeks connection in indirect ways. Watching from a distance allows them to stay close to the emotions they fear confronting directly. And ironically, the more emotionally unavailable you become, the more visible your absence often becomes in their inner world, even if they never openly admit it. The moment avoidants realize your value is rarely loud or dramatic. It's usually quiet, delayed, and happens long after the relationship has already changed. During the connection, when emotional intimacy is present and expectations start to grow, avoidants often feel an internal pressure they can't easily explain. Closeness may feel good on one level, but on another level it activates discomfort, fear of losing independence, or the sense of being emotionally trapped. So instead of fully leaning in, they begin to create distance. At that stage, they are not truly measuring your value, they are managing their internal emotional state. This is why they often seem uncertain, inconsistent, or emotionally distant even when the relationship is going well. But the real shift happens after you are no longer as available. Once the emotional presence, consistency, and familiarity you provided are gone, their perception slowly begins to change. What once felt normal or even taken for granted starts to stand out in hindsight. The comfort of your presence, the emotional safety you offered, the way you understood them, And even the small routines you built together begin to register more clearly only in your absence. This is one of the core paradoxes in avoidant attachment. They often struggle to fully appreciate emotional closeness while it is happening, but begin to process its importance once it is no longer accessible. When the relationship ends or emotional distance becomes permanent, avoidants enter a different psychological state. Without the immediate pressure of intimacy, their nervous system calms down, and suppressed emotions begin to surface more clearly. Memories that were once pushed aside now feel more meaningful. Conversations replay differently in their mind. Even moments they once dismissed can suddenly feel significant. This is not because the relationship changed, but because their emotional defenses are no longer blocking reflection. However, it is important to understand that this realization is not always immediate or even fully conscious. Avoidants are often not aware that they are reassessing your value in real time. It can appear gradually as curiosity, nostalgia, or emotional discomfort. They may start thinking about you during quiet moments, checking your social media, or mentally comparing current experiences to what they had with you. But instead of expressing this directly, they often stay in observation mode because vulnerability still feels risky. One key factor that triggers this realization is emotional contrast. When you are consistently available, emotionally engaged, and trying to maintain connection, your presence can feel like the baseline. But when that presence disappears, the absence becomes noticeable. The mind naturally compares before and after, and it is in that contrast that value becomes more visible. This is also where distance plays a psychological role. The more space there is between you, the more room there is for reflection. Without emotional pressure, arguments, or expectations, avoidants can finally process what the relationship actually meant to them without feeling overwhelmed. This often leads to a delayed form of appreciation, where they recognize qualities they were unable to fully acknowledge in real time. From a psychological perspective influenced by Carl Jung, this can also be understood through the idea that people only integrate certain emotions after separation from the source of emotional intensity. In other words, understanding often comes after detachment, not during immersion. For avoidance, emotional distance doesn't just create space from the other person. It also creates space from their own defenses. And in that space, the emotional truth of the connection slowly becomes harder to ignore. One of the most draining patterns that develops in relationships with avoidance is the quiet shift where you stop being a partner and slowly become a therapist, rescuer, or emotional caretaker. It often starts with good intentions. You see their emotional distance, their inconsistency, or their struggle with vulnerability, and you begin to believe that if you just love them correctly, stay patient enough, or communicate better, you can unlock the emotional connection you're hoping for. But over time, this dynamic becomes a cycle that slowly exhausts you while doing very little to actually change the relationship. The more you try to fix them, the more responsibility you unknowingly take for emotions that are not yours to carry. Avoidants often struggle with emotional awareness and vulnerability, but they are still responsible for their own emotional growth. When you step into the role of fixing, explaining, or constantly adjusting yourself to keep the connection alive, the relationship becomes imbalanced. You begin to overanalyze their behavior, interpret their silence, manage their moods, and constantly try to prevent emotional distance before it happens. This creates a subtle but powerful shift where your emotional energy revolves almost entirely around them, while your own needs start fading into the background. The problem is that avoidant patterns are not solved through external effort or emotional persistence from another person. In fact, too much emotional pressure or over-involvement can intensify their withdrawal. So the more you try to help them open up, the more overwhelmed they may feel internally, which can lead them to pull away even further. This creates a painful loop where your efforts to save the relationship seem to produce the opposite result, making you try even harder in response. This cycle can slowly turn into emotional burnout. You may start feeling anxious, confused, or even responsible for their emotional state. You might find yourself questioning what you did wrong, how you can communicate better, or what else you need to change to finally be enough. Over time, this creates a mindset where love becomes conditional on your ability to manage someone else's emotional world. But the reality is that no amount of self-sacrifice can replace someone's willingness to face their own emotional patterns. One of the most important psychological insights, often connected to the ideas of Carl Jung, is that real change comes from internal awareness, not external rescue. People grow when they confront their own unconscious patterns, not when someone else carries the emotional weight for them. When you become the fixer, you unintentionally interrupt that process by overfunctioning in the relationship while they underfunction emotionally. This doesn't mean avoidance cannot grow or change. It means that growth cannot be forced, controlled, or substituted by your effort. The healthiest relationships happen when both people take responsibility for their own emotional world. That includes boundaries, self-awareness, and the willingness to sit with discomfort instead of avoiding it. Letting go of the fixing role is not about giving up on someone. It's about stepping out of a cycle where you lose yourself while trying to save them. When you stop over-explaining, stop over-giving, and stop managing their emotional reactions, you begin to see the relationship more clearly. And often, what becomes clear is whether there is real mutual effort or just one person trying to hold everything together alone. When it comes to avoidant attachment, the moment someone finally reaches out again is rarely random. It's usually the result of a slow internal shift rather than a sudden emotional decision. Avoidants don't typically return because of one emotional breakdown or a dramatic realization. Instead, several subtle psychological triggers build up over time until reaching out feels safer than staying silent. One of the strongest triggers is emotional contrast. During the relationship, closeness can sometimes feel overwhelming, so distance feels like relief. But after enough time passes, that relief can turn into emptiness. The absence of emotional connection becomes noticeable, and what once felt like freedom starts to feel like loneliness. This contrast between past emotional warmth and present silence often becomes the first doorway back. Another major factor is loneliness, but not in the simple sense of missing someone constantly. It's more about specific moments, quiet nights, stressful days, or emotional lows, when there is no longer a familiar person to subconsciously rely on. Avoidants are often very independent on the surface, but that doesn't mean they don't form emotional bonds. They do, but they tend to disconnect from those bonds when intimacy feels intense. When the intensity is gone completely, the emotional system slowly starts to feel the gap. Curiosity also plays a powerful role. One of the biggest mistakes people make after a breakup with an avoidant is reacting emotionally in a way that feels natural in the moment, but ends up pushing the other person even further away. When someone you care about suddenly becomes distant, cold, or unavailable, the instinct is often to do more. More texting, more explaining, more emotional expression, more attempts to fix what feels like it's slipping away. But in avoidant dynamics, this emotional intensity usually has the opposite effect of what is intended. Instead of bringing closeness, it increases pressure. And pressure is exactly what avoidants are wired to escape from. Emotional reactions like begging, repeated messages, long emotional paragraphs, or trying to force closure can unintentionally activate their internal defense system. Avoidants are highly sensitive to feeling overwhelmed or emotionally trapped, even if the intention behind the communication is love or reconciliation. When they sense rising emotional demand, their natural response is to withdraw further, shut down, or create more distance in order to regain a sense of control. This is not always a conscious decision. It is often an automatic protective reaction built over years of associating emotional intensity with discomfort. Becoming the one they fear losing is not about playing games or pretending to be someone you're not. It's about returning to a version of yourself that exists outside of emotional dependence, uncertainty, and constant validation seeking. After a breakup, especially with someone who leans avoidant, people often unknowingly shrink their world around the relationship. Thoughts revolve around the other person, emotions depend on their responses, and self-worth becomes tied to whether they come back or not. Over time, this creates an energy of chasing, and that energy changes how you are perceived. Not because you are less valuable, but because emotional dependence creates pressure, and pressure often disrupts attraction in avoidant dynamics. Rebuilding yourself is what shifts that entire pattern. The first shift is confidence, but not the surface-level kind. It's the internal confidence that comes from no longer negotiating your worth. Instead of asking, "Do they still want me?" you start asking, "What do I want for myself?" This subtle change removes desperation and replaces it with clarity. When you stop trying to prove your value to someone else, you naturally start behaving in a more grounded and self-assured way. That grounded energy is noticeable, even without words. Purpose is the second shift, and it's one of the most powerful. When your life becomes full again, through work, goals, learning, health, friendships, and personal growth, you are no longer emotionally orbiting the relationship. This doesn't just distract you, it reestablishes identity. Avoidant dynamics often intensify when one person becomes the emotional center of the other's life. But when your purpose expands beyond the relationship, the emotional imbalance begins to dissolve. You are no longer waiting, you are living.